Welcome to CADA Lunch and Learn. We have 4 speakers today, Dan and Sarah, and our guests, Dom and Lizzie, retail and hospitality directors from leading commercial property agency, Bruce Gillingham Pollard, to discuss the emerging retail and hospitality property trends. Just a little housekeeping, we'll all be muted to avoid any background noise, and I would encourage all of you to put your questions into the chat and we'll run through them later. Sarah, I'll hand over to you to get this started.
Thanks, Meha, and thanks everyone for joining us today, and a special welcome to Dom and Lizzie. Just a little bit about BGP. You act on behalf of the UK's biggest landlords, including Hammerson, Land Securities, the Crown Estate, Grosvenor Estate, and the Canary Wharf Group. And you specialise in connecting leading brands with the best international locations. And you focus as the leasing team on delivering relevant tenant mix strategies, placemaking, and ensuring long-term success of these locations. So just a little bit of background for everyone here today. And to kick us off, perhaps, Dom, you could tell us a little bit about how the right retail and restaurant mix draws the crowds and why that's successful and why it's important.
Sure, thank you, and thanks for having us. I guess firstly, it's prudent to probably talk about what we mean when we talk about retail in this day and age. Traditionally, retail, I think people think shops, fashion, and the traditional high street. I think for the purpose of this discussion, we need to make the point when we talk about retail, that encaptures your traditional retail uses, so fashion, but also restaurants, cultural uses, amenity uses, and services, which all come under this banner. And we all see as a business, and our clients see as vital parts of a holistic tenant mix. So given the businesses that we work with, so that's estates, developers, centre owners, we place this massive focus on placemaking, and actually looking at the holistic view of the tenant mix as a means of improving dwell time, improving footfall, and diversifying the customer base. We see that each of these different areas of that retail sphere that I've talked about serves a purpose. So whereas traditionally you may have a row of very similar in nature fashion retailers, we now see the value, particularly of having a diversity of uses, which broadens the pool of customers you're getting to an area. And ultimately, that complementary mix of uses next to each other enables each to perform well, which we'll touch on a bit more with the anchors in a bit.
Thanks, Dom. I mean, and are there some examples that can bring that to life of places where you feel like that works really, really well? I don't know if Lizzie wants to jump in here. I know we talked about Notting Hill, for example. I know you work with Canary Wharf, high streets in general.
Yeah, I think kind of what Dom is saying, we want to sort of complement without cannibalise. So we're looking to kind of create these destinations for people. And I think in terms of sort of like examples that we do that are in kind of like traditional shopping streets, like for instance Chiltern Street, which is on the Portman Estate. They have kind of your more sort of traditional anchor of having Chiltern Firehouse, which is the hotel come restaurant. And then we've sort of got a mix of really exciting new entrant sort of independent boutique brands, but also kind of new international brands that come in that don't necessarily want to be on sort of your bigger shopping streets such as Marylebone High Street, but want to be part of this community that we're creating via this sort of tenant mix strategy. They know that we're not going to put in an occupier next to them that will sort of cannibalise their trade, but rather complement it. And we look to do that as well across kind of developments as well. So with sort of the upcoming Grosvenor development, South Morton Triangle, that's obviously a huge new mixed use office, retail, leisure, restaurant development, which has a huge tenant mix strategy behind it, that we make sure that whilst kind of planning for the preamble up to the leasing and marketing of the scheme, we're creating sort of a community, not just for the office workers that are going to be there every day, but the people kind of coming out of Bond Street Tube, obviously the new Crossrails there, but also the tourists that you're kind of grabbing off Oxford Street and Bond Street. And we do that via these sort of really thought through retail and restaurant mixes, and we sort of interdisperse the fitness and the leisure parts through them to kind of create this sort of big dwell footfall driven consumer spend area that people kind of want to hang out in and want to spend money in.
So it's about looking beyond the really obvious sort of street names like Regent Street, Oxford Street, that people are on Bond Street, that people are obviously very familiar with. And actually, from a brand's point of view, it must be considerably more attractive to be under the auspices of an estate, because an estate will be taking placemaking into account and will really be thinking about, beyond the brands that are there, how that mix works, would you say?
Yeah, I think if you look at Carnaby Estate as a whole and Shaftesbury Capital's ownership there, Kingly Court is a really excellent example of how restaurants coexist with retail and have that relationship where they're mutually beneficial to each other. And obviously creating these pit stops, as Kingly Court does for the shopper on Carnaby Street, gives people a reason to stay there longer and ultimately increases the spend in the retail. And there's that circular effect of keeping a customer in an area and drawing their focus in so that they're spending more time in that area and have a more rounded shopping experience.
Absolutely, that makes sense. Don, you talked about anchors at the beginning of the discussion. Do you think, I mean, anchors, I think you would traditionally think of the likes of, John Lewis or Marks and Spencer. Are there new anchors that are emerging as part of a really robust tenant mix, would you say? Are we seeing change there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen a lot of examples of this in a lot of the developments we've worked on, and particularly in new areas where you're starting to create a brand for a place. I think ultimately, sort of the fundamental reasoning behind this is that worker and visitor patterns have changed, partly due to the pandemic, partly because of e-commerce. And ultimately, we're having to find different ways, and retailers are having to find different ways, and landowners are having to find different ways to pull people into an area and make sure that they're still shopping those streets, those areas, and ultimately supporting their tenants. And diversifying those uses creates a greater range of customers. And I think from that, we've seen this emergence of different anchors, and that there's still ultimately a place for the large format retailer and like various iterations of department stores. But now what we see is ultimately gyms can act as anchors, music studios can act as anchors. We look at cultural uses such as nighttime venues, live music spaces, theatres. All of these we see as vitally important in being that next wave of anchor that support a development of an area. I think a very good example of fitness doing this is in Eccleston Yard, so one of Grosvenor's developments that sits very much on the border between Victoria and Belgravia. Barry's Bootcamp were the first tenants to go into that development, and ultimately it's created this amazing mix of lifestyle brands that all wanted to sit alongside Barry's. What Barry's are excellent at for that development is making sure that there's people coming into the scheme from first thing in the morning at their sort of 6 a.m. class right until the evening. And whether that's first thing in the morning, then going to use one of the beauty offerings in your local area, or using a restaurant afterwards in the evening, all of these things have that sort of that knock-on effect and have a positive impact on the area. Similarly, using a restaurant as an anchor opportunity, Wood Wharf, which is the sort of residential quarter of Canary Wharf, the first major restaurant letting that took place in Wood Wharf was to Hawksmoor, and they're on a sort of 12,000 square foot floating pavilion that was built in the Netherlands and towed over and sits at the very entrance to that. And what that's enabled us to do is also attract a different consumer base to what we're traditionally looking at Canary Wharf. It gives a destination shopper or visitor going to Canary Wharf a reason to go there as well. But it also has that knock-on effect on us attracting different brands. So I think as well as the anchor effect on bringing consumers in, the anchor effect is also very important in bringing like-minded businesses into an area. And off the back of that letting, we've been able to secure Row, who are Fallow's second restaurant, who very excitingly opened a couple of weeks ago, and we have some more leisure uses that are in the pipeline for that development as well. So it's sort of twofold, that process. It's that consumer effect, but also the impact on bringing in like-minded and complementary businesses.
Is this kind of a replication of what would have or what still does naturally happen in kind of neighbourhoods that spring up and evolve over time? So what you and the landlord are doing are really trying to replicate that kind of natural mix that you'd see in places, whether it's a smaller town or a village or a part of London, as we're talking about London, that would have organically grown like this at one point.
There's obviously that does happen to an extent, and I think in particularly residential developments, that's important. Obviously, all the different types of real estate that we're working on, there's different drivers and different things are important to our different clients. So the reason for doing a letting on Heddon Street, just off Regent Street, is going to be very different to doing something in Wood Wharf. But yes, effectively, in many instances, we're looking at you want things to feel organic. I think that's important. It doesn't want to feel too contrived and prescriptive. But yes, there's an element of that.
And what are tenant brands looking for as well? You know, in terms of coming to these, you know, as Sarah said, moving away from the obvious streets, moving away from the obvious high foot traffic areas. What is it that attracts potential tenants, whether they're retailers, hospitality operators, from, you know, to go somewhere that might have a lower footfall, that might feel a bit more secondary at the time, but is maybe more interesting?
I think from a retail perspective, it's really interesting because we've seen brands acting kind of as anchors for those maybe more secondary locations. So whereas you kind of would traditionally have had like a smaller format size department store, or something that was kind of like a big anchor sort of supermarket or something like that, you're seeing brands such as sort of Aesop or Ganni going into these secondary locations such as like Westbourne Grove, and giving confidence to other like sort of like-minded brands to follow them. We've seen, I mean, Westbourne Grove is an amazing example of that, where Ganni have just taken a store there off next to Aesop, who've kind of been there for a couple of years, but since Aesop have been expanding so much, they've kind of given more confidence to other sort of like-minded brands, and that's created a halo effect. So we're seeing the secondary locations sort of gaining these brands that wouldn't necessarily have been there before, but have kind of confidence that if Aesop are there or if Ganni are there, then obviously the spend or the trade or the footfall is clearly there for me, and that in itself kind of generates more confidence and more sort of footfall, and generally then kind of a bigger tenant mix starting to evolve. But I think that's definitely kind of been the case in neighbourhoods, whereas sort of on your traditional Oxford Street, Regent Street, Bond Street, where we've sort of lost those bigger department store names such as Phoenix, or obviously kind of the bigger names a couple of years ago, we have been replaced by bigger format flagships where the brand itself becomes the anchor, and they're sort of doing more internally in the store to kind of promote to their customer base. So they're kind of moving into the experiential. Obviously, Apple did that quite a long time ago in Regent Street and now in Knightsbridge, but they were obviously offering classes and kind of talks. And in the same way that they've done that, Microsoft have kind of taken their corner. And then we see sort of other brands such as Puma, Abercrombie, they're all under offer on Oxford Street, and they are all looking to kind of speak to their customer via sort of run clubs or DJ nights, or kind of other ways of bringing basically in that customer. So that's sort of our new wave of anchor that we're seeing on the like more traditional retail side.
So would you say there's been a resurgence of retail at key shopping destinations in London?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, there's been a huge resurgence. I think we're kind of seeing the least amount of vacancy that we've ever seen across our key shopping streets. I think there's so many kind of reasons why, and it's hard to sort of pinpoint what exactly has caused that resurgence. Obviously, we had a couple of years fallow with COVID, and then obviously we had the big rates revaluation, but I think other things have contributed, such as the pound being fairly weak and kind of just general occupancy cost rebalancing, that have basically decided that brands want to now just take space. And instead of kind of resurging in the way that we traditionally knew a shopping or retailer brand to want to take lots of stores, they're now condensing into one larger format store. And for Oxford Street, for example, we are getting kind of multiple bids on units, which kind of a couple of years ago were sort of candy stores, etc.
Yeah.
But H&B have obviously gone back into their store. We've got a unit, the Body Shop, which is on the corner opposite Bond Street Station. That's had multiple bids at quoting level or above, which we kind of didn't have a couple of years ago. So we're definitely seeing that kind of growing confidence in that street, especially. And it's pretty exciting, but now we're sort of running out of space, which is becoming sort of the other end of the problem, and needing to kind of create more space for these brands that are kind of keen to get in and want to trade and engage with their customer.
It's interesting to hear it from your perspective in terms of, sites being under offer, multiple bids, etc., because I think the rhetoric in the press is still reasonably negative in terms of retail. And it sounds like from what you're saying that's not the picture on the ground.
I mean, I think it's sort of quite like a trad statement to be saying that Oxford Street is struggling. It was very sort of the moment during COVID and potentially during the candy stores, and when rates were extremely high and the brands there hadn't really reinvested in their fit outs, and it was all kind of looking a bit tired. But I think with a lot of the redevelopment that's been happening there, and I think since those kind of liabilities have come down and brands have kind of a renewed interest and excitement to have a London flagship, I think we're seeing across kind of the whole street, and especially with Regent and Bond as well, like a dramatic loss in vacancy. And yeah, as I kind of said, multiple bids on units. So I think it's probably outdated to say that Oxford Street is really struggling or people don't want to be there. I think it's definitely moving in the right direction, and it's exciting to kind of be able to announce some of these openings and potentially change that rhetoric in the press.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about the investment. From what I've read, the Tottenham Court Road end is doing a lot better than the Marble Arch. And look at things like Tixerant, for example, being a real draw. I think it's the most visited tourist attraction, which, obviously all you have to do is walk through it on your way there. You don't have to sort of queue up and get a ticket or anything, but still drawing people to that end of the street. And it seems that vacancy rates there are considerably lower than the Marble Arch end at the moment. But yeah, new openings in the last year. I think H&B, Under Armour, Rituals, Uniqlo's opened a third store. Abercrombie and Fitch, I mean, you all know all of this. Primark is going to be investing in both of its stores to the tune of 100 million. Both of its stores at both ends of Oxford Street. Obviously, we've got IKEA to come.
Well, I think IKEA is going to be really interesting, just because, from a UK point of view, which is where we're really focused on, is that, we've seen what they've done in Hammersmith, which is to think about how they can kind of localize their product and create a store that works for a residential customer that isn't driving or, going to load purchases in the traditional way from their warehouse stores into their car or a hired van and take it home, but actually is going to use it more as a showroom. But it'll be fascinating to see what IKEA do when they take over the Topshop site finally next.
Really
I think it's 2025 now. There's been some further delays, but that has a chance to really transform that part of around Oxford Circus. And I think the Outernet is a really interesting example, Sarah. And we touched on anchors earlier on, and that seems to me to be very much at the point of it being a kind of a new sort of anchor that wouldn't have been almost describable even 5 years ago, starting off as an open space that's very much about presentation and impact and digital experience. But and behind that is now really beginning to tick up as a venue, and so it's working a bit like the gyms, a bit like Dom's example of Barry's boot camp is actually it's creating an attraction that's working through a number of day parts.
Exactly. I just realised we've talked a lot about retail. We haven't really touched on restaurants. What's happening, guys? What are the emerging restaurant trends out there? Are you seeing international interest in the London market?
I think that's one of the most exciting things, is a number of international entrants that are either opening or looking to open in London at the moment. So that's whether that's Europe with the likes of Nouvelle Garde looking in London, or Big Mama, both from Paris, or Honest Greens from Madrid. We also seeing a lot from the Middle East, so the Main on Hanover Square, or Major Food Group from the US, soon to be opening in Mayfair. There's this whole range of brands that are bringing this new exciting talent into London. And I think that's one of the sort of key things we're seeing at the moment, and one of the most exciting things we're going to see over the next 12 to 18 months is some openings from some new entrants, which creates, again, more of a point of difference in London as a dining location.
And what is it about? Is there a common thread with these new entrants? Are they offering something that we don't have, that isn't currently done particularly well in London, or are they all different and unique in their own ways?
I think they're unique and different in their own ways. I think it's a really interesting question as to why they're coming to London. I think ultimately London is still a world-leading destination for hospitality. And I think a lot of the international operators see London as a sort of safe landing for new talent. Our culture and the makeup of London is very cosmopolitan. So coming in with a new style of cuisine or a new brand, Londoners generally, as a population, are very open to new experiences and new restaurants. So I think a lot of them see that as a huge opportunity to capture on that. I think London's dining reputation on top of that has just grown exponentially. Turnover figures have got so much stronger. And I think the barriers to entry into London are fewer than some of our European counterparts in particular. I mean, if you look at Milan, for example, it's very difficult to acquire property. In France, the nature of the dining landscape is still dominated by traditional Parisian and French restaurants. So the very nature of London being super international and having that already this amazing eclectic mix of F&B, and it's seen as a good landing for these brands. I think there's also something to be said for particularly brands from the Middle East and Asia as looking at London as a sort of stepping stone to expansion in the rest of the world, be that the States or other parts of Europe. But if we're looking at a lot of those brands, particularly from the UAE, for example, they see this as a sort of natural progression before moving into the US.
And in terms of brands coming here that have got a kind of high service model, wherever they're from, and really want to give a tremendous and standout experience to their customers, how is we post-COVID and post-Brexit, we had a lot of pressure, both in hospitality and from retailers, about the challenge of recruiting and retaining staff. Is that settling down, or is that still something that brands have to focus on getting right here?
I think everything I've said about the positives, there are still undeniably massive challenges to the F&B market. Inflation obviously has, for the prevailing 12 months, been incredibly challenging, and that knock-on effect on the margins of these businesses. But you're right, the talent pool post-Brexit has been an enormous challenge for the sector, and something that I think moving forward, people are going to have to be a lot more collaborative about as a sector as a whole, but also the landlord impact on that as well. So the Crown Estate, who we work with, actually held an initiative at one of their sites in Piccadilly last year, and they brought together a range of their customers, which included BAFTA, Fortnum & Mason and Gordon Ramsay restaurants, and hosted this effectively a careers fair for over 200 people attending to explore jobs in the hospitality sector. And directly that day, actually, 30 people were offered jobs from that events fair, and there was a lot of follow-up conversation on that as well. So I think it's something that, excitingly, we're seeing our clients recognise, and I think there's something to be said for that partnership thing spanning further within the sector. I think with these challenges, estate landlords in particular are showing a willingness to be far more collaborative and acknowledging those challenges that operators are seeing and working with them to overcome them.
No, I mean, it absolutely makes sense, that sense of partnership. Jumping back into restaurant trends, if you don't mind, are you seeing Are you seeing any particular sort of market positions doing very well? Are you seeing a lot of high-end restaurants interested in London, or are you seeing the sort of is the middle market doing well, or are you seeing the sort of the in and out quick and dirty brands?
No, I think there's probably a slight trend of polarization, so that either people seek value or they want more of an experience in their dining, and that doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be super high end, but I think it means a meal that feels more special, and maybe is an independent restaurant or a group of restaurants that sit underneath an umbrella and offer a more unique dining experience. So I definitely think there's been a polarization in that sense, and those two sectors remain the strongest, for either the value proposition or the more experiential dining.
So that could be. I mean, Big Mama have been. You mentioned them earlier on. You know, they've been a very successful in London with 5 sites now, I think. But you know, that is as much about the experience as it is about what arrives on your plate, I think.
Yeah, I think actually Big Mama's a very interesting restaurant in that actually they have managed to create an amazing product of experience-led dining, but by maintaining a fairly democratic price point. And I think they're one of the best at doing that. Equally, I think that is often more difficult, and I think they're a rarity in that sector. So no, it's a very good point. They've done that particularly well, and that's driven by their design and their service and that whole theatre you get with the dining, but they managed to keep the price point relatively reasonable alongside it.
Absolutely. Another thing we've seen in restaurants is obviously we've seen a huge resurgence in recent years of vegetarian and maybe to a greater extent vegan restaurants landing and doing well. Are you seeing any trends in that sector of the market, either that they're holding their own, plateauing, or perhaps not managing to retain the same levels of growth?
I think there was probably an issue with an oversaturation very quickly of a lot of these vegan brands. There's actually some that are well established and have come out of that sort of surge into their sector that pre-existed it and are very successful. So you look at Mildred's and their sister brand Mallow as a business, they were sort of first to market in that sector, and they have consistently performed well and are looking at expansion still. And that's but equally, on the flip side, if you look at a business like Neat Burger, they came into the market, made a huge splash, and albeit this was a much more accessible price point on that product, but they took a lot of real estate and actually have retrenched and are sort of likely to be leaving the UK market completely. So I think it was a case of oversaturation. And actually that's sort of stabilizing now, and we're seeing the sort of best in class in that sector as the ones that have come through it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think perhaps it makes more sense to offer options for people who wish to eat vegetarian and vegan rather than necessarily an entire brand, entire restaurant, and insist that everyone is on the same page. But we just had the hand from Meher, which means I must now ask my last question. So going back to, and it's one for everyone really, for all of us, looking back at Oxford Street, we're all aware of the ongoing stories about whether Marks and Spencer is likely to be renovating its Oxford Street branch. It's gone back and forth a few times, and obviously none of us has a crystal ball or can see into the future, but really a more general one about flagships, about anchors, about M&S, which is in the paper again today, bumper profits in today's times. How important, how relevant is a brand like that, and how relevant is that store, that Marble Arch store, to Oxford Street? How important would you say it is?
I mean, obviously, I think kind of us all talking about it sort of before we're doing this live webinar, just how important sort of having these new traditional anchors are. And like, it's just such a kind of main staple British heritage brand, especially on kind of a British high street that sort of people recognise. and it still has that dual functionality of having kind of the food store beneath it with the grab and go for kind of your key office workers, etc., and sort of local residents, and then sort of the fashion homewares. They've really diversified their sort of makeup and jewelry ranges, taking on and kind of consuming other brands and selling those as concessions is super important. And it's almost in a way one of the sort of remaining style of department stores that we kind of know as being at that Marble Arch end. And I think kind of going back to the point of having a brand as an anchor or a flagship, they are very much sort of part of that conversation from a retail perspective. So having them leave would definitely leave a hole at that end of the street. But I'm sure someone else kind of coming in would have big shoes to fill, but would have to be doing it in a similar way. So another large brand offering kind of those multi-touch points and that kind of element of kind of having your experiential, so being able to kind of buy food, but also kind of buy something for the home and also something for the family. They really do cater to everyone. So yeah, I mean, it would obviously be a real shame if they weren't kind of granted their plans and be able to kind of modernize and kind of get the store back to what it should be and how it should trade, considering that they clearly have the firepower to do it. And we should sort of be recognizing that as a British brand.
No, absolutely.
And what I think is interesting, isn't it? Because what they're trying to do is really, you know, from their perspective, create a building that is fit for the 21st century, rather than one that is getting on for 100 years old and has, you know, challenges and limitations around it. And we saw a bit of, you know, the discussions around John Lewis and Oxford Street have quietened down over the last year or two. But, you know, through the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about them reducing the amount of floors that they trade from a retail point of view, and adding either office space to let above it, or potentially even changing some of that into residential, being in the centre of London. So there's clearly challenges around those very large flagships that were conceived 50 or more years ago, when there wasn't any sort of online you know, if you wanted anything, you had to go to a store and buy it wherever it was. And the size of the flagship and the scale of a store that stocked everything was a really important part of that. And it still succeeds in capital cities with those almost independent one-off department stores. Selfridges and Harrods are the most obvious in London. You know, where that at a luxury level, or at a high mid-market up to luxury level, there's still a sustainability for that. But it's clearly challenging in the mass market. That those stores are obviously overspaced now, and the space needs to be rethought and replanned.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they're just not being able to innovate. And I think what we've realized from stores not being able to kind of innovate and change and understand their customer and evolve, they become sort of out of favor and then really struggle to get back in favor again. So by kind of allowing a brand in their physical space to do that, we're obviously supporting their kind of growth and then further success. So yes, it would be a really kind of important thing to see in some iteration or form, and be able to do that, even if it isn't kind of on the plans that they've currently got drawn up.
Yeah, and we see in our clients, one of the things that's really become higher up the agenda over the last 5 years is flexibility in design, because trends are changing, customer needs are changing, new things are happening at such a pace now that you can't design a store and know confidently that it's going to deliver what it does on day one after 10 or 15 years. You know that by year 2 or 3, there are going to be some minor evolutions. There are going to be changes. There are going to be new product lines that come in, or different ways of shopping, or experiences that need to be put in. And so it's really important that the flexibility is high on retailers and everybody's agenda in terms of how space is used, because change is ever quicker.
No, exactly. And one of the things is that if brands don't innovate, they just get left behind. It sounds so obvious, but one of the things that people have talked to us, that more people have said to me, and I've experienced and told more people about, is the checkout at Uniqlo. which is just so brilliant because it's so easy to use. And that's only the checkout. So you wouldn't think that was at all an important part of the experience. It's not the product, it's not what you wear, but because it's such a remarkably easy to use experience, people talk about it. And that sort of experience at the end of the transaction will start to become, you know, sort of expected industry standard. So it's one example of something that you might think of as slightly, you know, a little bit boring, pedestrian, but actually being quite important.
No, I mean, it's the whole reason why you're there, isn't it? To spend. They want to take your money and you want to spend it. So if that's the hardest part of the whole transaction, then they're failing in their kind of objective and like ultimate goal.
Exactly. Shall we give her a chance to ask any questions?
There is a preempted question, and I'll give people, so while I ask this, it will give people a chance to add their questions to the chat. Is there a brand or company or something any one of you or all of you would like to see emerge in the UK that you've seen abroad?
I've got one because I was talking about it to a client yesterday.
Go for it.
And it's a pretty obvious one, but I think I was talking yesterday to a food client, hospitality client, and we were saying how Sweetgreens is a really great concept in the US, and there's a gap in the market, we feel. I know there's some others doing it, so I'm happy to be proven wrong in a minute by Lizzie and Dom, who will tell us that we're just not out in the right places. But Sweetgreens seems to me to be a great success. It's been going for about 15 years. They've now got almost 1,000 sites in the US. But as a healthy salad brand that really embraced digital from the very beginning in terms of its customer journey and how it works, and how it's set up to deliver an experience and deliver a personalized product to customers. I've not seen anything as strong as that in the mid-market, and I'd really like to see it here.
What do you think, Lizzie? And
for Dan.
Are you going to tell us we're in the wrong places?
No, well, I think that might be one for Dom, just because you've done quite a lot with Attis, and you've been speaking to Sweetgreens a bit on and off.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of food talent I'd love to see in London. I think if you look in the US at the moment, there's a lot of particularly high-end restaurant groups circling, whether that's quality branded or Union Square hospitality. All of those would be fantastic additions to the London market. The customer profile of New York, where the majority of their presence sits, is quite similar to London. So I think it can have a big impact and will be hugely successful here. So those two groups from an F&B perspective, I would love to see. And then I think there's talent from all over Europe. I mentioned Nouvelle Garde earlier, who are, I guess there's a similarity in their experience-led element to Big Mama, but it's a French brand focused on French brasseries. They're also soon to be opening in London as well. So I think that would be an exciting one for the market.
And you touched on a couple of US-based groups who are premium and based in New York. Is there are the operating costs and setup costs similar if you're coming from New York to London? Is it basically like for like, or are there more or less barriers?
No, if you're coming from New York to London, is probably for the types of restaurant we're talking about. So that experience-led dining, you're probably at about half the cost in London of setting up in New York. It's a massive saving on that. So yes, that's one barrier that's less. I mean, staff costs are high here, but the US economy is strong at the moment, so it's an opportunity for those brands to I think it's a good time for them to be stepping into London and grabbing that opportunity.
And you're seeing quite a lot of that influx and that interest for those reasons.
Yeah, no, definitely.
I think we're seeing that as well with the American brands like coming over in the fashion sector. It's just really affordable at the moment for them. And it's kind of never been a better time to kind of find space. And obviously the New York and the London customer have such similarities. So that's something that I think will kind of only increase as the year progresses, with just more kind of international entrants, especially from the US. just because of how strong the dollar is at the moment.
Yeah, and Lizzie, just to go back to Meher's first question, is there a brand that you would like to see, or an operator that you'd like to see come here?
I think we're quite lucky with the London market. We do get a lot of cross-pollination with overseas. So I think they're all kind of trying to come over. There wasn't necessarily one specifically. I think the only thing I'd maybe comment on is that we do boutiques very well in London, and we're kind of known for that and have kind of a very good track record for it, and it's very exciting, and we do townhouse concepts, and that's really sort of engaging. But something that we can't cater to is sort of these like larger format stores that kind of carry bigger lines, bigger collections, bigger collaborations, and that's something you can kind of get in sort of the American market. So when they come across, often it's translated very differently in the UK market. They sort of expect to be finding a sort of 10,000 square foot site in the middle of Marylebone, whereas they have that in LA and want to replicate it, and that's something that they can't necessarily do. So we do get kind of a little bit more maybe of a refined shopping experience in London because we're not getting that breadth of collection. So that's maybe something that would be quite interesting to see with the influx of new development happening in London, with these bigger units being created. We might see bigger kind of brands bringing more of their collections and like a chance to shop sort of wider within each brand and label and like shop generally.
I was just going to ask, where are those kind of larger units coming into London? Because I always immediately think, when you talk about that size, I remember when Anthropology opened on Regent Street probably 15 years ago, and they took 3 or 4 floors, and you felt as though you had that full brand experience that you would have done if you'd been to New York, which is quite unusual at the time.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, the Debenham store, obviously, that's being delivered. That's kind of like a 280,000 square foot scheme. Obviously, it will be mixed use, but you'll have kind of retail predominantly in it. Derwent have got their development on Oxford Street. That's like 150,000 square feet. Obviously, again, not all retail, but you're getting that ground floor presence. And then obviously with kind of Grosvenor, South Molton Triangle, you're getting the smaller footprints alongside the larger, more kind of flagship units on Brook Street, which will be like another opportunity for these entrants to come in and kind of secure something really prime Mayfair on a bigger scale that there isn't the supply for at the moment. So kind of back to that demand and supply thing at the beginning, where we've sort of run out of supply, but it's sort of coming, and the demand is sort of increasing as we're waiting for these projects to PC.
Well, it all sounds hugely exciting, doesn't it? In terms of, change is the only constant, and lots of interesting things on the horizon. Meher, I don't know if there are any more questions.
There are no more questions. I want to thank Lizzie, thank you, Dom, thank you, Sarah and Dan. It was a great session today. Thank you everyone for joining. You can catch this again and watch it again on YouTube. I'll be sending out the link. You can also catch up on our previous episodes on YouTube, or listen to it on our podcast on Spotify. If you have any inquiries or you want to speak to any of the speakers, feel free to email us at enquiries@cada.co.uk. We'll be happy to put you in touch. Thank you everyone, and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Lizzie and Dom.
Thanks, Lizzie.
Cheers.
See you later.
Thank you.